Nobody expected him to succeed. Not the British generals who thought his ideas were insane, not the conventional officers who believed jungle warfare was impossible, and certainly not the Japanese commanders who had conquered Burma with lightning speed and considered the dense jungle their impenetrable fortress. But Brigadier Orde Wingate had a vision that would change warfare in Southeast Asia forever. What began as a desperate experiment in unconventional tactics would become the Chindits, and the unit that Wingate led deep into Japanese-occupied Burma would prove that no terrain was too hostile and no enemy position too secure when innovation met absolute determination. March 1943, the Japanese Empire was at the height of its power in Southeast Asia. Having conquered Hong Kong, Singapore, Burma, and the Dutch East Indies in a series of brilliant campaigns that had shattered British colonial power. The Burma campaign had been particularly devastating for British prestige. An entire army had been forced to retreat across hundreds of miles of jungle, abandoning equipment, supplies, and any hope of quick victory. But the story of Orde Wingate's transformation from a conventional officer into the architect of revolutionary jungle warfare began years before the first Chindit crossed into enemy territory. Born in 1903 to a military family with strong religious convictions, Wingate had grown up believing that conventional wisdom was often wrong and that breakthrough solutions required the courage to challenge accepted thinking. His early military career had been marked by a series of unconventional postings that prepared him, almost accidentally, for the challenges he would face in Burma. Service in Sudan had taught him desert warfare and the value of mobility over static defense. His time in Palestine fighting Arab insurgents had shown him how small, motivated forces could neutralize much larger conventional armies through superior tactics and intimate knowledge of local terrain. But it was his controversial methods in Palestine that first established Wingate's reputation as a brilliant but difficult officer. His special night squads, formed to combat Arab attacks on Jewish settlements, used tactics that violated virtually every principle of British colonial policing. Instead of reactive patrols and static defenses, Wingate developed aggressive night operations that carried the fight directly to insurgent bases. The success of these operations was undeniable. Arab attacks decreased dramatically wherever the special night squads operated. But Wingate's methods were so unconventional and his personality so abrasive that many senior officers considered him more trouble than he was worth. His tendency to ignore regulations, his open criticism of conventional tactics, and his absolute certainty that his methods were superior created enemies throughout the military hierarchy. When war broke out in 1939, Wingate found himself assigned to relatively minor positions that kept his disruptive influence away from important operations. Many officers assumed that his career would never recover from his reputation for insubordination and unconventional thinking. They were spectacularly wrong. The conventional wisdom among British commanders was that offensive operations in the Burmese jungle were essentially impossible. The terrain was too difficult, the logistics too complex, and the Japanese too well entrenched in defensive positions that had been carefully prepared over months of occupation. Any attempt to retake Burma would require massive resources, overwhelming air support, and a conventional advance along established roads and rivers. Brigadier Orde Wingate disagreed completely. When Wingate arrived in Burma in 1942, he spent weeks studying the terrain, the climate, and the tactical situation with the obsessive attention to detail that characterized all his military thinking. What he saw convinced him that the conventional assessment was not just wrong but dangerously limiting. The jungle that British commanders viewed as an insurmountable obstacle could become the key to victory if approached with the right tactics and the right mindset. Wingate's analysis began with a simple observation. The Japanese had conquered Burma using conventional tactics along established routes, but they had not prepared for unconventional attacks from unexpected directions. Their defensive positions were oriented toward blocking conventional advances along roads and rivers, leaving vast areas of jungle territory essentially undefended because they assumed no military force could operate effectively in such terrain. This assumption, Wingate realized, was both their greatest strength and their most exploitable weakness. If British forces could learn to operate in the jungle as effectively as the Japanese operated along conventional routes, they could strike at targets that the enemy considered completely secure and force them to defend areas they had never thought vulnerable. But operating in the Burmese jungle would require fundamental changes in everything from tactical doctrine to individual soldier training. The traditional British emphasis on linear formations, established supply lines, and constant communication with headquarters would have to be abandoned in favor of small unit tactics. Self-sufficiency and independent decision-making at the lowest levels. Most challenging of all, British soldiers would have to learn to think of the jungle not as an enemy to be conquered, but as an ally to be understood. The dense vegetation that blocked visibility and movement could also provide concealment and protection. The rivers that seemed to divide the terrain into impassable sections could become highways for small boats. The isolation that made radio communication difficult could also make enemy detection nearly impossible. Wingate's concept was audaciously simple. Instead of fighting the Japanese where they expected to be attacked, British forces would infiltrate deep behind enemy lines, disrupt supply lines and communications, and force the Japanese to divert troops from frontline positions to deal with threats in their rear areas. The operations would be conducted by small, highly mobile units that could live off the land, navigate by compass through trackless jungle, and strike at targets that the Japanese considered completely secure. The theoretical foundation of Wingate's approach drew heavily on his experience with irregular warfare in Palestine, but the practical application would require innovations that had never been attempted on such a scale. Traditional military logistics assumed that armies moved along predictable routes where supply convoys could reach them regularly. Wingate's forces would operate hundreds of miles from friendly territory in areas where conventional resupply was impossible. His solution was revolutionary: air supply. Instead of depending on ground-based supply lines that could be interdicted by enemy action, Chindit forces would be resupplied by aircraft dropping supplies at predetermined coordinates. This would allow them to operate in areas where no ground force had ever ventured, while maintaining the supplies and ammunition necessary for extended operations. But air supply created its own challenges. Supply drops had to be precisely coordinated to avoid detection by enemy forces, accurately delivered to forces that might have moved since the original drop was planned, and conducted under weather conditions that could change without warning. Radio communication, essential for coordinating air supply operations, was notoriously unreliable in jungle conditions where atmospheric interference and terrain features could block signals completely. The British Army Command in India was skeptical, to put it mildly. Wingate's proposals violated every principle of conventional military thinking about jungle warfare. His suggested operations would require troops to march hundreds of miles through enemy territory with minimal supplies, no reliable communication with headquarters, and no possibility of conventional reinforcement or resupply. The skepticism was not entirely unreasonable. No Western army had ever attempted operations of the scale and complexity that Wingate was proposing. The logistical challenges alone were staggering. Maintaining a force of several thousand men in territory where the nearest friendly unit might be 300 miles away, coordinating multiple columns operating independently across thousands of square miles of unmapped terrain, and sustaining morale among troops who would be completely cut off from normal military support systems. More troubling for conventional commanders was Wingate's insistence that success would require abandoning many of the control mechanisms that armies used to maintain discipline and effectiveness. His proposed operations could not be micromanaged from headquarters because communication would be sporadic at best. Individual column commanders would have to make tactical decisions based on local conditions without guidance from superior officers. In many situations, individual soldiers would have to operate independently when separated from their units, which was likely to happen frequently during long-range operations. This level of autonomy was unprecedented in conventional military operations and ran counter to everything that British military training emphasized about maintaining unit cohesion and following orders. Many senior officers worried that giving such independence to junior commanders and individual soldiers would lead to chaos, indiscipline, and mission failure. But the desperate situation in Burma meant that unconventional solutions had to be considered. Japanese forces were preparing for an invasion of India itself, and British commanders were running out of options for stopping them. The conventional approaches that had failed so spectacularly during the initial Burma campaign were unlikely to produce better results in a second attempt, and the time available for developing new strategies was rapidly running out. Wingate's proposals were approved more out of desperation than confidence, but he was given permission to form an experimental unit and test his theories under actual combat conditions. The authorization came with strict limitations. His force would be small. His operations would be considered experimental, and he would have to prove his concepts quickly before more resources would be committed to his approach. The long-range penetration groups, later known as the Chindits, were formed in July 1942 from volunteers drawn from various British and Commonwealth units serving in India. Wingate's recruitment criteria were unlike anything the British Army had ever used. He was looking for men who could survive under conditions that would challenge explorers. Let alone soldiers, the initial recruitment process revealed just how radical Wingate's approach was compared to conventional military thinking. Instead of focusing on traditional military skills like marksmanship and parade ground drill, Wingate was looking for evidence of adaptability, independence, and psychological resilience. He interviewed potential recruits personally, asking questions about their backgrounds, interests, and experiences that seemed to have nothing to do with military service. What Wingate understood, and what conventional military training often overlooked, was that the skills needed for long-range penetration operations were fundamentally different from those needed for conventional warfare. Physical fitness was important, but mental resilience was crucial. Chindit operations would require soldiers to march 20 to 30 miles per day through jungle, so dense that visibility was often limited to a few yards. They would have to navigate by compass across terrain that appeared on no maps, find water in areas where rivers might be hundreds of miles apart, and maintain their fighting effectiveness while living on minimal rations for weeks at a time. Even more challenging would be the psychological pressure of operating in complete isolation from friendly forces. Traditional military training prepared soldiers to fight as part of larger units, where individual actions were coordinated and supervised by officers and non-commissioned officers. Chindit operations would often require individual soldiers to make life-or-death decisions without guidance from superiors, to maintain morale when separated from their comrades, and to continue fighting even when they had no idea whether their mission was succeeding or failing. Perhaps most importantly, Wingate needed soldiers who could operate independently when separated from their units, which was likely to happen frequently during long-range operations. Traditional military training emphasized following orders and maintaining unit cohesion, but Chindit operations would require individual initiative and the ability to make tactical decisions without guidance from superior officers, the volunteers who responded to. Wingate's recruitment came from diverse backgrounds that reflected the global nature of the British Empire's military forces. English, Scottish, and Welsh soldiers brought different regional traditions and skills. Gurkhas from Nepal contributed mountain warfare experience and an understanding of Asian terrain that would prove invaluable in jungle operations. African troops provided knowledge of tropical conditions and disease prevention. Indian soldiers offered linguistic skills and cultural knowledge that would be crucial for gathering intelligence and working with local populations. This diversity was not accidental. Wingate deliberately sought to create units that combined different types of expertise and experience. He understood that the challenges of jungle warfare would require solutions that no single military tradition could provide, and that innovation often emerged from the intersection of different approaches to common problems. Wingate was already known throughout the British Army as an unconventional officer whose ideas often bordered on the eccentric. He had served in Palestine before the war, developing counterinsurgency tactics against Arab rebels that emphasized mobility, surprise, and the use of local knowledge rather than conventional military doctrine. His methods had been successful but controversial. earning him both admirers and enemies within the military establishment. When Wingate arrived in Burma in 1942, he immediately began developing a radically different approach to jungle warfare. Instead of viewing the jungle as an obstacle to military operations, he saw it as an asset that could be used against an enemy who had become overconfident in their defensive positions. The Japanese had conquered Burma using conventional tactics along established routes, but they had not prepared for unconventional attacks from unexpected directions. Wingate's concept was audaciously simple. Instead of fighting the Japanese where they expected to be attacked, British forces would infiltrate deep behind enemy lines, disrupt supply lines and communications, and force the Japanese to divert troops from frontline positions to deal with threats in their rear areas. The operations would be conducted by small, highly mobile units that could live off the land, navigate by compass through trackless jungle, and strike at targets that the Japanese considered completely secure. The British Army Command in India was skeptical, to put it mildly. Wingate's proposals violated every principle of conventional military thinking about jungle warfare. His suggested operations would require troops to march hundreds of miles through enemy territory with minimal supplies, no reliable communication with headquarters, and no possibility of conventional reinforcement or resupply. But the desperate situation in Burma meant that unconventional solutions had to be considered. Japanese forces were preparing for an invasion of India itself, and British commanders were running out of options for stopping them. Wingate's proposals were approved more out of desperation than confidence, but he was given permission to form an experimental unit and test his theories under actual combat conditions. The long-range penetration groups, later known as the Chindits, were formed in July 1942 from volunteers drawn from various British and Commonwealth units serving in India. Wingate's recruitment criteria were unlike anything the British Army had ever used. He was looking for men who could survive under conditions that would challenge explorers. Let alone soldiers. Physical fitness was important, but mental resilience was crucial. Chindit operations would require soldiers to march 20 to 30 miles per day through jungle, so dense that visibility was often limited to a few yards. They would have to navigate by compass across terrain that appeared on no maps, find water in areas where rivers might be hundreds of miles apart, and maintain their fighting effectiveness while living on minimal rations for weeks at a time. Perhaps most importantly, Wingate needed soldiers who could operate independently when separated from their units, which was likely to happen frequently during long-range operations. Traditional military training emphasized following orders and maintaining unit cohesion, but Chindit operations would require individual initiative and the ability to make tactical decisions without guidance from superior officers. The training program that Wingate developed for the Chindits was designed to push volunteers beyond the limits of normal military preparation. Physical fitness was important, but more crucial was the development of mental resilience and the ability to operate effectively under conditions of extreme stress and isolation. The physical conditioning program was unlike anything attempted in conventional military training. Instead of the standard emphasis on parade ground drill and weapons handling, Chindit training focused on endurance, adaptability, and self-sufficiency. Recruits learned to march 30 miles in a day while carrying full equipment, to navigate through jungle so dense that they could not see more than a few feet in any direction, and to maintain their effectiveness while subsisting on minimal rations for extended periods. But the physical challenges were only the beginning. Wingate understood that the greatest obstacles to successful long-range penetration operations would be psychological rather than physical. Soldiers operating hundreds of miles behind enemy lines would face isolation, uncertainty, and constant danger that could break down morale and fighting effectiveness unless they were specifically prepared for these challenges. Jungle navigation training took place in some of the most challenging terrain available in India, where soldiers learned to find their way across trackless wilderness using only compass bearings and natural landmarks. The jungle environment was disorienting in ways that soldiers from temperate climates could not have imagined. Dense canopy blocked out the sun for most of the day, making it impossible to navigate by direction of sunlight. Thick vegetation limited visibility to a few yards, making it easy to walk in circles without realizing it. The constant humidity and heat created fatigue that affected judgment and decision-making. Traditional military navigation relied on maps, recognizable landmarks, and established routes that had been surveyed and marked by previous military operations. Chindit operations would take place in areas where no reliable maps existed, where landmarks were invisible from ground level, and where routes had to be improvised based on terrain features that might change with weather conditions. Water discipline was practiced under conditions that simulated the extreme dehydration that would be common during actual operations. The Burmese climate could cause soldiers to lose several quarts of water per day through perspiration alone, and clean drinking water might not be available for days at a time. Soldiers learned to purify water using improvised methods, to recognize the early signs of dehydration, and to ration their water supplies under conditions that created constant thirst. Medical training took on special importance because wounded or sick soldiers could not be evacuated during long-range operations. Every Chindit learned basic surgery, treatment of tropical diseases, and management of injuries that would normally require hospitalization. They practiced treating gunshot wounds with minimal equipment, setting broken bones using improvised splints, and managing fever and infection when modern medications were not available. The medical challenges of jungle operations extended far beyond combat injuries. Tropical diseases like malaria, dysentery, and various parasitic infections were constant threats that could disable soldiers more effectively than enemy action. Proper sanitation, food preparation, and personal hygiene became military skills as important as marksmanship or tactical movement. Weapons training emphasized not just marksmanship, but the ability to maintain and repair equipment under field conditions. With minimal resources, the constant moisture of the jungle environment could disable weapons in hours rather than days, and replacement parts would not be available during operations. Soldiers learned to field strip and clean weapons using materials found in the jungle, to improvise repairs using whatever tools they could find or make, and to maintain ammunition supplies under conditions that would ruin conventional equipment. Perhaps most importantly, every member of a Chindit unit learned to perform every function necessary for independent operation. Unlike conventional military units where soldiers specialized in particular roles, Chindit operations required that anyone might have to take over any function if other team members were killed, wounded, or separated from the unit. Radio operators learned medical treatment, medics learned demolitions, and officers learned to perform the duties of enlisted soldiers. Communication training was especially crucial because radio contact with headquarters would be sporadic at best during operations behind enemy lines. Soldiers learned to operate radio equipment under conditions that challenged every aspect of the technology: atmospheric interference that blocked signals, equipment that was constantly exposed to moisture and impact, and the need to communicate while avoiding detection by enemy radio monitoring stations. But communication challenges extended beyond technical problems with radio equipment. The isolation of operating behind enemy lines meant that soldiers would have to make crucial decisions without guidance from superior officers, coordinate activities with other units they could not see or contact, and maintain morale when they had no information about the progress of larger military operations. Wingate's training program included extensive practice in independent decision-making and small unit leadership. Soldiers practiced scenarios where they were separated from their units and had to find their way back to friendly territory, where their officers were killed and they had to continue the mission without supervision, and where they encountered situations that had not been covered in their original orders. The psychological preparation for these challenges was as important as the technical training. Soldiers learned meditation and mental discipline techniques that would help them maintain focus under extreme stress. They practiced operating alone for extended periods to prepare for the isolation they would experience during actual operations. They learned to manage fear, uncertainty, and the constant awareness that they were completely cut off from normal military support systems. The selection process for Chindit operations was designed to identify soldiers who possessed not just the physical capabilities needed for jungle warfare, but the mental and emotional resilience needed to operate effectively under conditions that would challenge the sanity of ordinary people. Wingate personally interviewed every potential recruit, looking for evidence of the independent thinking, adaptability, and psychological strength that would be essential for success. What emerged from this training process was unlike any military unit that had ever existed in the British Army. The men who completed Chindit training were capable of operating independently in terrain that would challenge experienced explorers, maintaining their fighting effectiveness while completely cut off from conventional support systems, and making tactical decisions based on local conditions without guidance from higher headquarters. The first Chindit operation, launched in February 1943, was both a test of Wingate's theories and a desperate gamble that could either vindicate his approach or destroy his entire unit. 7 columns of approximately 400 men each crossed the Chindwin River and penetrated deep into Japanese-occupied Burma, with orders to disrupt enemy communications and supply lines over a period of several months. The crossing of the Chindwin marked the beginning of the largest and most ambitious long-range penetration operation ever attempted by a Western army. The river itself was a formidable obstacle, nearly half a mile wide in places, with strong currents that could sweep away heavily loaded soldiers, and banks that were constantly patrolled by Japanese forces alert for any sign of Allied infiltration. Wingate's solution to the river crossing challenge demonstrated the innovative thinking that characterized all his operations. Instead of attempting to cross at obvious points where bridges or ferries might be expected, the Chindit columns crossed at remote locations where the Japanese had not established defensive positions. They used locally constructed rafts and boats that could be abandoned after use, leaving no evidence of their passage that might alert enemy forces to their presence. The crossing operations took place over several nights to avoid detection, with each column using different crossing points to minimize the risk that all would be discovered if one crossing was detected. Radio silence was maintained throughout the crossing operations, forcing column commanders to rely on predetermined plans and their own judgment, rather than coordination from headquarters. Once across the Chindwin, the Chindit columns found themselves in territory that no Allied soldier had seen since the retreat from Burma the previous year. The intelligence information available to Wingate was limited and often outdated, forcing the columns to gather their own information about Japanese positions, supply routes, and defensive arrangements as they moved deeper into enemy territory. The terrain that the Chindits encountered was even more challenging than their training had prepared them for. The jungle was denser than anything they had experienced, with vegetation so thick that visibility was often limited to a few feet. Navigation was complicated by the complete absence of recognizable landmarks and by atmospheric conditions that made radio direction finding unreliable. Water sources were scarce and often contaminated, forcing the columns to carry heavy loads of purified water or risk debilitating illness from drinking untreated jungle water. The constant humidity and heat created conditions that sapped energy and made normal exertion exhausting. Equipment that had functioned perfectly during training began to malfunction under the extreme high conditions of actual operations. But the most challenging aspect of the operation was the psychological pressure of operating in complete isolation from friendly forces. The soldiers knew that they were hundreds of miles from the nearest Allied unit, that no rescue was possible if things went wrong, and that their only hope of survival was to complete their mission and successfully withdraw to British territory. Despite these challenges, the operation began successfully, with Chindit columns reaching their target areas undetected and achieving complete surprise in their initial attacks. Japanese garrisons that had been established to control key river crossings and supply dumps found themselves under attack from forces that seemed to appear from nowhere, strike with devastating effectiveness, and disappear back into the jungle before reinforcements could arrive. The first successful attack came at Bonchong, where a Chindit column destroyed a crucial railway bridge that carried supplies to Japanese forces throughout northern Burma. The bridge had been considered completely secure because it was located more than 200 miles behind the front lines, in an area where no Allied forces were believed to be operating. The attack on Bonchong demonstrated the potential effectiveness of Wingate's tactics. A conventional assault on the bridge would have required a major offensive involving thousands of troops, extensive air support, and weeks of preparation. The Chindit attack was carried out by fewer than 100 men who approached undetected, placed explosive charges with precision timing, and withdrew before Japanese forces in the area could respond. The destruction of the bridge disrupted Japanese supply operations throughout the region for several weeks, forcing them to divert resources to repair work and defensive measures that had not previously been necessary. More importantly, the attack demonstrated that no target in Japanese-occupied Burma could be considered completely secure, forcing enemy commanders to disperse their forces to defend installations that had previously required no protection. Following the success at Bonchong, other Chindit columns achieved similar victories at targets throughout northern Burma. Railroad facilities, supply dumps, communication centers, and administrative installations that had been considered invulnerable found themselves under attack by forces that seemed to appear from the jungle without warning. The psychological impact of these attacks was enormous. Japanese commanders had assumed that the jungle provided complete security for their rear areas, and the sudden appearance of British forces hundreds of miles behind the front lines shattered their confidence in their defensive arrangements. Troops had to be diverted from frontline positions to guard supply lines that had previously been considered completely secure. Intelligence reports intercepted by British code breakers revealed the extent of Japanese confusion and concern about the Chindit operations. Enemy commanders were reporting attacks by forces of unknown size and capability, operating in areas where no Allied presence had been detected by conventional reconnaissance. The unpredictability of the attacks was forcing Japanese planners to consider threats that they had never anticipated and to develop defensive measures for scenarios that had not been part of their original strategic planning. But the operation also revealed the enormous challenges of sustaining long-range penetration groups in hostile territory. Radio communication proved even more unreliable than expected, leaving column commanders unable to coordinate their activities or request support when needed. Atmospheric interference, equipment failures, and the need to maintain radio silence to avoid detection combined to create communication problems that sometimes left columns completely isolated for days at a time. Air supply drops, which were supposed to provide the bulk of the Chindits' logistical support, were often inaccurate or impossible due to weather conditions. The jungle canopy made it difficult for aircraft to locate drop zones, and high winds could scatter supplies over wide areas where they could not be recovered. When supply drops failed, columns had to rely on captured enemy supplies or forage for food in areas where edible plants were scarce and often dangerous. Navigation proved to be more difficult than anticipated, with compass readings affected by local magnetic anomalies and dead reckoning complicated by terrain that forced frequent detours from planned routes. Several columns became lost for days at a time, using valuable time and energy to relocate themselves rather than pursuing their operational objectives. Most seriously, the constant stress of operating in enemy territory began to take a severe toll on the men's health and morale. Tropical diseases that had been manageable during training became serious threats when soldiers were operating under extreme physical stress and could not receive proper medical treatment. Malaria, dysentery, and various parasitic infections began to disable soldiers at rates that threatened the operational effectiveness of entire columns. The psychological pressure was equally debilitating. Soldiers were constantly aware that they were completely cut off from friendly forces, that capture would likely mean execution rather than imprisonment, and that even minor injuries or illnesses could become life-threatening when medical evacuation was impossible. The stress of maintaining constant vigilance while navigating difficult terrain and carrying out complex missions began to affect judgment and decision-making. Sleep deprivation became a serious problem, as columns had to maintain security watches throughout the night while operating in areas where enemy patrols were active. The combination of physical exhaustion, psychological stress, and inadequate nutrition began to create casualties that were not directly related to combat action, but which reduced the fighting effectiveness of the units just as seriously as battle injuries. After 3 months behind enemy lines, Wingate ordered the surviving Chindit columns to withdraw to British-controlled territory. The decision was based on intelligence reports indicating that Japanese forces were converging on the areas where the Chindits were operating, making continued operations increasingly dangerous and less effective. The withdrawal itself became an epic of endurance and survival that tested the limits of human capability. The columns had to traverse hundreds of miles of hostile territory while being actively pursued by Japanese forces who had finally begun to understand the nature of the threat they were facing. Many of the routes that had been used for infiltration were now blocked by enemy forces, forcing the Chindits to improvise new paths through even more challenging terrain. The physical condition of the men had deteriorated significantly during 3 months of operations under extreme conditions. Many were suffering from tropical diseases, malnutrition and exhaustion that made normal movement difficult and fighting effectiveness marginal. Equipment had been worn out or damaged by constant use under harsh conditions, and ammunition and medical supplies were nearly exhausted. But the most challenging aspect of the withdrawal was maintaining unit cohesion and morale when soldiers were pushed beyond the normal limits of human endurance. Some men had to be carried by their comrades when they could no longer walk. Others continued to function despite illnesses that would have hospitalized them under normal circumstances. The bonds that had been formed during training and operations became crucial to survival, as soldiers supported each other through conditions that would have broken individuals operating alone. But the cost had been severe. Of the approximately 3,000 men who had crossed the Chindwin River, only about 2,000 returned, and many of those were so weakened by disease and exhaustion that they required months of recovery before they could return to active duty. The conventional military assessment of the first Chindit operation was mixed at best. The casualties had been heavy, the tactical gains had been temporary, and the operation had consumed resources that might have been used more effectively in conventional operations. Many senior officers concluded that Wingate's theories had been proven wrong, and that long-range penetration operations were too costly to be practical. But Wingate himself drew different conclusions from the operation. The problems that had emerged, communication difficulties, supply challenges, medical issues, were not inherent flaws in the concept of long-range penetration, but technical problems that could be solved through better equipment and improved procedures. More importantly, the psychological impact of the operation had been enormous. The Japanese had been forced to acknowledge that their defensive positions in Burma were not impregnable, and British morale had been boosted by the knowledge that offensive operations against the Japanese were possible. Wingate used the lessons learned from the first operation to develop new tactics and procedures for an expanded Chindit force. Radio communication was improved through better equipment and more sophisticated codes. Air supply procedures were refined to provide more accurate and reliable delivery of supplies to forces operating behind enemy lines. Medical support was enhanced through better training of unit medics and improved procedures for treating tropical diseases and combat injuries under field conditions. Perhaps most importantly, the selection and training procedures for new Chindit recruits were modified based on the experience of which types of soldiers had performed best during the first operation. The second Chindit operation, launched in March 1944, was far more ambitious than the first. Instead of 7 small columns, Wingate deployed 6 full brigades, approximately 20,000 men, in a coordinated offensive designed to support the Allied advance in northern Burma and disrupt Japanese preparations for their own offensive against India. The scale and complexity of the operation was unprecedented in the history of jungle warfare. Entire airfields were constructed behind Japanese lines to support the Chindit brigades, and a sophisticated air supply network was established to maintain the force during extended operations in enemy territory. The initial phases of the operation were spectacularly successful. Chindit forces seized key transportation centers, established fortified bases in strategic locations, and began systematically disrupting Japanese supply lines throughout northern Burma. The Japanese were forced to divert substantial forces from other operations to deal with the Chindit threat, significantly weakening their defensive capabilities. But tragedy struck just 3 weeks into the operation. On March 24, 1944, Orde Wingate was killed in a plane crash while traveling between Chindit positions. The loss of their commanding officer was a devastating blow to the Chindits, both tactically and psychologically. Wingate's unique understanding of jungle warfare and his ability to inspire unconventional thinking had been crucial to the success of the operations. Without Wingate's leadership, the Chindit operations gradually lost their innovative edge and began to resemble more conventional military activities. Despite these problems, the second Chindit operation achieved significant strategic results. Japanese forces in Burma were weakened by the constant pressure on their supply lines and communications, contributing to the eventual Allied victory in the Burma campaign. Perhaps more importantly, Wingate's innovations changed military thinking about the possibilities of unconventional warfare. His demonstration that small, highly trained forces could achieve strategic results in terrain previously considered impossible for military operations opened new possibilities for special operations throughout the world. The techniques developed by the Chindits influenced the development of special forces units in many armies, and the principles of long-range penetration became standard elements of modern special operations doctrine. Wingate's emphasis on individual initiative, innovative tactics, and the willingness to operate under conditions that challenged conventional military wisdom established him as one of the most influential military thinkers of the 20th century. The jungle that had been considered impenetrable became a highway for specially trained forces. The supply lines that had been thought secure became vulnerable targets for small mobile units. The defensive positions that had seemed impregnable were proven to be only as strong as the thinking behind them. Orde Wingate had shown that the most important weapon in any army's arsenal was the willingness to think differently about supposedly impossible problems. His legacy lived on in every special operations unit that learned to see obstacles as opportunities and to turn enemy advantages into weaknesses through superior tactics and unshakable determination. The mad genius of Burma had proven that there was no such thing as impossible terrain, only impossible thinking. In the jungles where conventional armies feared to operate, Wingate had created a new form of warfare that would influence military operations around the world for generations to come.